Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone's doing well. We're back with another session of the book, which will be the last one before the new year. So let's not waste any time and let's just get straight back into it and read off from where we left off. So, all of this censorship, police repression, and violent agitation by the oligarchy of a liberal democracy was not enough. It would help that this was actually out of the way. Kahane's party continued to grow in popularity, with polls around the country showing that showing that it was going to be the third largest political party, a challenge to the Tweedledee and Tweedledum of the left and right. Maybe I was right first time, then maybe they are Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Anyway, back on point. The oligarchy realised that they needed to protect their cosy power relationship by banning Kahane's party. Even if those are Marxist parties, because in reality those fringe parties are nowhere near gaining explicit power. Such fringe parties allow the oligarchy to pretend that it really is a democracy, and that change can be brought about through creating a political party to address voter concerns. Those who see severe political problems are thus drawn into the political parties who can change nothing and who will be destroyed if they should get close to challenging the power of the oligarchy. Joining an existing party and taking it over from the inside is also very rare, and will be fought tooth and nail by the oligarchy who control the infrastructure of that party. To some extent, Thatcher managed this with the Socialist Party, but despite her success, the oligarchy removed her when she was no longer useful to them, and she threatened to take on the EU. On the left, Trotskyists tried this with Britain's Labour Party, but they were foiled by Blair and his New Labour. The cosy oligarchy shouting at each other in Parliament, pretending they oppose each other, pretending that the public has choices, when the choice is between the twins of Tweedledee or Tweedledum. The case of Kahane illustrates that the oligarchy will bend over backwards, abandoning all of our principles to hold on to power, exactly as Orwell showed in Animal Farm. It is important that one appreciates the sheer brazen contempt for democracy of the Knesset law that gives the Knesset Elections Committee the right to ban a party on the basis of an interpretation of the law as it sees it. The Knesset Elections Committee is an out-and-out political body, composed of all political parties in the Knesset. The grounds on which Kahane's party was banned was the allegation that the party was racist. Yet Kahane was not interested in racial differences or categories. He was following the principles of the Constitution of Israel. Technically, Israel's constitution is an evolving series of basic laws. The foundation of the State of Israel is their Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is the founding document of the State of Israel and is regarded as an expression of the nation's vision and its central beliefs. As such, it is similar to France's Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, Britain's Magna Carta, and the US Declaration of Independence. Whether you support the existence of Israel or not is irrelevant. The document that is the foundation of the political and legal system of Israel says that it is a Jewish state. In this context, Kahane only wanted Jews to have the right to vote. If non-Jews in Israel wanted to convert to Judaism, they could do so and then be equal to Jews politically. Those who called for a Jewish state and who framed laws that discriminated against non-Jews, the laws of return and the Jewish National Fund, did so because they intended that non-Jews would never control the Jewish state. Hitler's National Socialists didn't allow Jews to convert to being Aryans, yet Kahane was equated with the National Socialists. We hope you can see the significance of what was done to Kahane. Kahane could see the strife in Israel caused by communists and Muslims, and he sought to solve this by following the logical conclusions of the documents which formed the legal and democratic origin of the state. And you know what? I'm going to go get a fucking coffee, because I can't keep yawning like this. Right, mug of coffee at the ready. Bickies at the ready if I need them as well, though I hope not. So, let's get back to where we were. Which was, but with the oligarchy, but the oligarchy were happy to subvert democracy. Ready to side stroke number one. Ready to side with communists and Muslims against Zionism. Because everywhere the oligarchy are serving their own interests, and the coffee is serving to give me a stroke. The oligarchy in Britain are not serving the interests of the electorate in whose name they claim they are exercising political power. The oligarchy are literally using the undemocratic power they have to ship in millions of people to replace the electorate, happening in Britain but also in France, USA, Sweden, Netherlands, and Germany, etc., etc. As Kane points out, if the founders of Israel did not intend Jews always to have political power, why is it that the Israeli legal system grants Jews all over the world the right to move to Israel to live? Why not allow anyone to move there? Why not import millions of Muslims and Hindus, the way the British oligarchy have done? Kahane realised that even with the law of return, non-Jews could eventually simply outnumber the Jews through birth rates alone, and they practically are here in the UK. And he sought to use the legal democratic process to allow Jews to decide if that should be, if there's people bloody separate, allowed. But instead, the oligarchy decided that they would persecute Kahane and his supporters. And when that did not work, the oligarchy decided that they would subvert democracy instead. It's no surprise to us that during the COVID pandemic, or maybe I was right first time, the oligarchy in Israel were one of the most draconian in the world. It is also no surprise that the oligarchy would rush to vaccinate their population with an experimental gene therapy. Because always and everywhere, the oligarchy serves their own interests, whilst disguising this by pretending they are looking after the welfare of the electorate. Yeah, and for us, protecting the NHS and all that shit. But I digress. Let us consider some profound observations about the way representative parliamentary democracy works. Oh, my tooth is really giving me problems. The concept of representative government is admitted by all not to be the ideal of democracy. That can only be when each and every citizen personally and directly votes on the issues affecting him. That is true in pure democracy. And pure, real democracy becomes even more grossly distorted by the rise of the party system. A thing that more and more, as the party system grows more powerful, comes into conflict with clear popular aspirations. That the interests of the parties and the men who run them often stand in opposition to the views of the people is too clear to be even seriously debated. As the party grows more and more powerful, its ability to entrench itself and frustrate the vote through the creation of a political system, that is the self-perpetuating one, grows. Parties in Parliament can vote themselves huge amounts of funds that give them an unbridgeable advantage over other parties, and certainly over any new ones that may seek to compete with them. Parties can and do create parliamentary rules that favour to an unbearable degree the large party over the small and new ones. Election rules are made that are clearly biased against new parties and against change. In short, a political media grows up, involving several parties, even those of bitterly differing views, whose common interest in retaining power creates a united front of political venality and empire. Worst, the dictatorship of the party acquires a contempt for the electorate based upon a confidence of the impotence, or in the impotence rather, of the people to change the situation. That comment isn't by socialist George Orwell, nor socialist Robert Michaels, nor socialist Jack London. It isn't from a true British liberal of the 19th century. It isn't even Rousseau, arguably the man who inspired the revolutions in America and France. No, those are the words of the far-right, anti-democratic, racist Rabbi Kahane, assassinated in mysterious circumstances in the very year he wrote those words. You can see from the case of Kahane that it's not the case that the oligarchy are the Jews. In a Jewish state, the oligarchy abandoned all political principles to destroy a Jew who was a threat to the oligarchy. A menace because he could provide the public with a channel for change that was not in the direction the oligarchy was planning. Kahane does not explicitly recognize that what goes on in Israel and other democracies is really oligarchy, but he comes close to this recognition. He says that his party sent fear down the spines of the political mafia that has run Israel, in one form or another since its inception. In such moments, he recognizes that what this mafia are concerned about above all else is their power, not any political or moral principles. That's why, in the case of countries like Britain, the oligarchy can import a replacement population that, if it doesn't already arrive with an ideal of stroke number two, with an ideology of violent hatred towards others, such as Islam, this replacement population is taught to hate the indigenous people. Because replacing the population is what the oligarchy across the West is doing. See chapter 5.4. In case you are thinking, well, what happened to Kahane was long ago, things have changed. Consider what happened on October 7th, 2023. Hamas and other Islamic groups launched a coordinated attack on civilians in Israel, massacring women and babies, massacring deluded young Israelis at a peace concert, raping and beheading and taking back into Gaza about 250 hostages. It was precisely the kind of attack described with the pride in books like The Life of Muhammad, the oldest and most authoritative Islamic biography of the founder of Islam. See Appendix 12. It was clear from the very first hours that the jihadis in Gaza had been spending years mixing with their targets in Israel, mapping out where and who they would attack, free to do so because the Israel oligarchy had subverted democracy to stop Kahane. Not only did the oligarchy in Israel facilitate this attack by their negligence, but they immediately lied to the Israeli public about the ideological motivations for the attack. On multiple occasions, the Israeli Defense Force spokesman said, "These Islamic terrorists are un-Islamic." The Israeli oligarchy has no excuse to misunderstand Islam. Over the last 30 years, many of the prominent people who have documented and exposed the lies of the oligarchy concerning Islam have either been Jews in the West or Israeli Jews. Some of them are even professors at universities in Israel. So what can possibly explain the ignorance of the Israeli Jews about Islam? Even the philosopher Maimonides, whose exact words Kahane used to expose the oligarchy's efforts to silence him, had written about the systematic oppression of Jews under the iron heel of Islam. Maybe it should be called the iron sandal of Islam. That's my fucking alarm going off again. I actually forgot to turn that one off. Anyway, back on point. Israel's oligarchy, do not want the non-Muslims to understand Islam. If the oligarchy in Israel are ensuring that the Jewish citizens that are kept ignorant about Islam, do you really think the Israeli oligarchy were going to be funding Pim Fortune, Tommy Robinson, or Renaud Camus? Camus is credited with the phrase, the Great Replacement, and we discuss him in chapter 5.2. Everywhere, the oligarchy kept the public in a state of permanent deception, as Jack London described in his 1908 novel, The Iron Heel. If you are prepared to believe the lie that you live in a liberal democracy, don't be surprised when the oligarchy lie to you about everything else. A man with a penis and a beard is a woman. Islam is peace. Population replacement is a myth. Immigration boosts the economy. The welfare state cares for you. mRNA vaccines are safe and effective. There is no problem in Ukraine with National Socialists, etc., etc. Chapter 3.8 Oligarchy in the Netherlands. In case you think the example of Israel is exceptional, consider what has been going on in the Netherlands. Wherever they are, the oligarchy will manipulate the public by dividing people into different groups. Depending on the past narratives used by the oligarchy, and depending upon their current needs and plans, the oligarchy will have certain mascot groups, and the general rules and the laws will be bent for the mascot groups. The mascot groups will receive special state funding to send the mascots in the direction most useful to the oligarchy. The oligarchy will fund climate protesters, drag queen story time, abortion groups, mosques, and even jihadis. However, should some member of the mascot group resist in the direction in which the oligarchy has planned to go, then the oligarchy will plan to destroy them. This was the case in the Netherlands with the stroke number 3, politician Pim Fortuyn. Over 20 years ago, Pim Fortuyn, a gay Marxist sociology professor, created a political party to put a stop to the rising tide of immigration. He was compared to Hitler by the oligarchy, and in the end he was assassinated. Fortuyn had warned that the news media comparisons of him to Hitler would lead to his assassination. He was murdered by a leftist vegan animal rights activist. The killer vegan only served 12 years in prison. The problem for the oligarchy was removed, and after a brief stint in prison, the assassin was rewarded by the oligarchy with a new identity, while someone who would normally be a mascot at the historical juncture, a gay Marxist, would have been removed from the oligarchy. Now, I'm going to pause for a sec here. Isn't it a coincidence that some of these people who have gone against the oligarchy have basically been the target of assassination attempts? Unfortunately for these poor souls, these ones succeeded. Who else was going to go against the oligarchy, I wonder, of present day? Donald Trump. And they attempted to assassinate him. Coincidence? I think not, personally. Compare the oligarchy's treatment of Fortuyn's assassin with their treatment of Pim Fortuyn, Rabbi Kahane, Tommy Robinson, Renaud Camus, etc., etc. The person who was a convicted murderer is protected. The people who advocate for democratic change are demonized by the oligarchy. If the oligarchy's use of legal mechanisms to remove the dissident fail, or are too slow, the oligarchy will ramp up the 2-minute hate to get someone to assassinate the demonized dissident. And look what it talks about literally seconds later after I just said it. In 2024, the world saw that Donald Trump, with all the supposed protection of the most powerful country on earth, came within an inch of an assassination by a leftist. Literally just talked about it. Fucking unbelievable. We suspect that in 2 decades, most people in Britain, or after 2 decades, most people in Britain can't ever remember about hearing about Pim Fortuyn. What were the policies of Fortuyn? Fortuyn had made bold statements about Islam, multicultural society, immigration and asylum policies, and his political opponents. Statements like, I'm in favour of a cold war against Islam. Islam forms a serious threat to our society. Rotterdam's Dagblad, August 28, 2001. You have to understand mosques as a front organisation in which martyrs are being bred. His opponents, however, kept up their end up and disqualified Fortuyn as dangerous. A Polder Mussolini, right-wing extremist, ego tripper, a political wild man, racist and narcissist. Did the Dutch people dislike the policies of Fortuyn, the gay Marxist? No. After his assassination, Pim Fortuyn was voted by the public the greatest Dutchman of all time. Considering how popular he was, it's no surprise that the oligarchy realised they didn't have time to stop him by using legal mechanisms. The assassination was reported as Holland's first political assassination in 400 years. So he was hated by the oligarchy but liked by the public. The oligarchy, their journalists, their state-approved communist groups like Hope Not Hate, all act as if they oppose violence and hatred. But hatred of the dissident is stoked in the hopes that the threat of the oligarchy is assassinated. Many Dutch voters correctly saw that the mainstream parties, the oligarchy, all sang from the same pro-Islam, pro-immigration song sheet. Fortuyn's first political party wanted direct democracy and more power devolved from the central government. By ensuring that Fortuyn was demonized and murdered, the Dutch political elite were able to continue their abuse of democracy and prevent their agenda from being derailed for decades. Thus, the assassination risk for those who are a threat to the policies of the oligarchy comes from Muslims and leftists, and who knows, maybe even the secret services of the state. The dissident is smeared as far-right or racist, then the state-funded charities go after the dissident. What the oligarchy requires is a plausible deniability as the arm's-length instigators of the assassination. One of the MPs from Fortuyn's party, elected after the leader's assassination, said that highly placed political civil servants inside the Department of Home Affairs refused to give Fortuyn personal protection, as this would play into Fortuyn's hands and reinforce his popularity. Despite several years in which attempts were made to prosecute politicians for their role in the assassination of Fortuyn, the oligarchy are above prosecution, remembering Jack London pointing out in The Iron Heel that the oligarchy own the legal system. Moreover, whilst it was out of the question that the assassin had acted alone, no one else was prosecuted. The assassin of Kahane was also not known to have acted alone. There were also doubts about the attempted assassination of Donald Trump in July 2024, which looks highly suspicious given the incompetence and negligence of the professional US government agency dedicated to protecting people like Trump from assassination. Before the assassination of Pim Fortuyn, the police intercepted a phone call from the activist group of which the assassin was a member, in which call it was stated Fortuyn had to die. Then, just before the assassination, the activist group was dismantled, indicating that police and intelligence agencies were aware of the planned assassination. From the preparations and how the assassination was carried out, the assassination had clearly a professional manner. Almost a decade after the assassination of a Almost a decade after the assassination, a 4-part documentary about the case was broadcast on Dutch TV, a series which was watched by about 1 in 30 of the adult population. In the wake of the Fortuyn assassination, Geert Wilders had permanent protection from armed police, and for decades, Wilders had been sleeping in different secret locations each night, barely seeing his family, in order to forestall another assassination by a leftist or Muslim. But despite having to provide Wilders with the protection they denied Fortuyn, the oligarchy have gone after Wilders in the same way they have went after Fortuyn, with demonisation and endless legal harassment, including Britain's Labour government banning the Dutch MP from entering Britain. The oligarchy tell us they can't keep out the terrorists and illegal immigrants, but the oligarchy can stop the entry of elected MPs from other countries in the EU. Even now, when Wilders' party has had the most MPs out of any party in the Netherlands, the oligarchy are refusing to work with him, making sure normal constitutional procedure isn't followed, preventing Wilders from being the Prime Minister. So more than 20 years after Fortuyn was assassinated by the oligarchy have continued to derail the political will of the people of the Netherlands. The oligarchy in the West will have dissidents persecuted and killed rather, than have the oligarchy's program of population replacement derailed. Chapter 3.9 Iron Heel crushes dissent. Coffee has done me a fucking treat, let me tell you. Other than the one stroke I had earlier. Anyway, when parents send their children to private schools, they are already planning out the child's future decades in advance. They may already have an idea of what profession the 8-year-old child will be doing by the time the child is 28 years old. Well, clearly my mum didn't, because otherwise I'd probably be like a lawyer or a doctor or something. Anyway, not all their plans come to pass. But they still have planned and tried to enact the plan They've tried to enact that plan over several decades. In the vast majority of cases, someone is either born into a family that is in the oligarchy, or they must spend years scrambling up the ladder to get increasing status within the oligarchy. Put a foot significantly wrong, and the oligarchy will destroy that person. We have already discussed Rabbi Kahane and Pim Fortuyn, but another example is the journalist Johan Hari, who was the Independent's star journalist. The Independent star journalist. Yeah, I know, I'm struggling not to laugh at that as well. Hari left the self-styled Independent newspaper after being accused of plagiarism, which basically means passing off the words of others as his own. Hari had graduated from Cambridge University, and from there he was immediately a star journalist, his work appearing in many of the world's famous newspapers. Independent columnist darling of the left and Orwell Prize winner extraordinaire. So what precipitated his ejection by the oligarchy in 2011? In February 2011, London was covered with stickers declaring the area a gay-free zone, and on 24th February 2011, Hari published an article about the problem of Muslim homophobia in Britain. By June 2011, his decade-long career as a journalist was over. The destruction of Hari's career began on June 17, 2011, with this from a far-left website. Here's a little insight into the workings of the mainstream media. We've long found this piece, emphasis added, of super-liberal journalism from The Independent in 2004. The first piece posted on the website was from the end of January 2011. The last piece posted on it was December 2011. Within 3 months of Hari stepping out of line, the allegations of his plagiarism appeared, and within days of the charges appearing on the far-left website, The Guardian, Forbes, Business Insider, The Telegraph all piled on. Hari became an unperson, and the Muslim declaration of London as a gay-free zone was dropped down the memory hole. Others in Hari's position have learned the lesson: step out of line and your career is over. No one noticed, no one cared about plagiarism, while Hari was working in line with the oligarchy, such as supporting, I'm not calling him sir, Tony the war criminal Blair's invasion of Iraq, an invasion based on bogus documents about weapons of mass destruction, manufactured by Britain's secret services. Is it any wonder that those on the low levels of the oligarchy know not to step out of line? In February 2011, the police told a community gathering of gay people from London that they had CCTV of a large group of bearded Muslims leaving the huge state-funded East London Mosque and progressing to cover the area with signs declaring London a gay-free zone. There were journalists in the meeting. We spoke with someone who was in the meeting, but none of the journalists reported this detail about the CCTV. The first time the BBC reported on the gay-free zone was on the 22nd of February more than a week after the signs were first discussed on the other websites. The BBC was saying, residents tackle East End gay-free zone stickers, implying falsely that it was Muslims who were removing the signs. A group of Muslims were arrested, but only one of them, an 18-year-old immigrant, was convicted, not of any form of hate crime, but merely a small fine of vandalism. When the mascots of the replacement population come into conflict with another mascot group, the mascots find out which group has the more power. Obviously, the oligarchy appeased the group with a 1400-year-old history of murderous terrorism. Islam. What did the gay community do? They just tutted. A couple of weeks after that, a lone Muslim got a slap on the wrist. The oligarchy ended Johan Hari's career as a star journalist. The same young Muslim immigrant was later convicted for drawing burqas over adverts depicting non-Muslim women, and then subsequently received a conviction for possessing of terrorist material. A few years later, this Islamic mascot was a social media star alleged to have pocketed $200,000 from a charity. The gay journalist who sought to draw attention to the problem of Islamic hatred from homosexuals had his career destroyed. Most of the Muslims whose hateful actions prompted him to speak out escaped prosecution or criticism, and the Muslim convicted got no real punishment and went on to become a social media star with with millions of followers and with access to huge amounts of money. It's clear which mascot group the oligarchy favour. See chapter 4.4 below. But before we do that, we're going on to chapter 310. Censorship and thought control. Which will probably be the final chapter I mention, as we are coming up to time. My God, this thing is quite long, actually. Fuck me. Anyway, after Orwell had finished Animal Farm, a fairy story, he could get it he could not get it published. For decades, the liberal intellectuals refused to believe that the stories about this censorship are a fairy story by one of the 20th century's most famous thinkers. The 1987 edition of the book contains the original intended preface to the first edition of Animal Farm, as an appendix entitled The Freedom of the Press. So it was some 40 years after the novel first appeared before the public got to see the evidence of a censorship, which makes the theme of draconian censorship in Orwell's 1984 more important. The unpublished preface to Animal Farms details oligarchy systematic censorship in Britain, and how they were preventing the publication of Animal Farm. Fuck, I dropped some. I need a bib. Anyway, where was I? Orwell complains that in this country, intellectual cowardice is the worst enemy. The sinister fact about literary censorship. I cannot read now. Fuck me. I'm losing IQ. Sorry. Maybe I can get them to work a little bit harder on the hamster wheels. Anyway, the sinister fact about literary censorship in England is that it is largely voluntary. Unpopular ideas can be silenced and inconvenient facts kept dark without the need for any official ban. The unpublished preface notes that, frustrated with the censorship from the mainstream publishers, Orwell was considering paying to publish the book himself. When Orwell eventually found a publisher, the preface on the willingness of the oligarchy in Britain to censor was removed from the book. Ironically, in doing this, Orwell was himself complicit in concealing how the oligarchy behaves. Animal Farm was being censored because it exposed how the oligarchy works, and in doing so it also showed how they have no principles and they were ready to rewrite history. Pause. Over the space of a... Wait. Sorry, my brain is not working now. Over the space of a decade, genocidal Bolshevism went from being the enemy to being the ally to being the enemy again. And in our day, after every Islamic terrorist attack, the oligarchy get the public to beat Islam is the religion of peace. Yeah, well, the oligarchy can fuck off right now if they think I'm going to bleep that shit. Orwell says that the particular groupthink that was leading to censorship in liberal Britain in the 1940s was the West alliance with the Bolshevik Soviet Union. At this moment, what is demanded by the prevailing orthodoxy is an uncritical admiration of Soviet Russia. Everyone knows this. Nearly everyone acts on it. Any serious criticism of the Soviet regime, any disclosure of facts with which the Soviet government would prefer to keep hidden, is next door to unprintable. Compare this with how the oligarchy provide uncritical admiration of Islam, and how no criticism or even factual disclosure comes from the oligarchy about Muhammad was a slave-taking, aggressive warlord who tortured those he robbed to reveal where their gold was hidden. Feminist politicians wear hijabs and burqas, as required by Muslim men. White historians and theologians, I cannot pronounce this word. Theologians, keep quiet about what they know is the true nature of Islam. Over 5 decades, the communists in Britain allied with Islam against the working class schoolgirls who were being systematically raped by Muslim gangs. When it comes to concealing the truth in the 1940s, Orwell selects just one main example of the oligarchy distorting the facts about the history of Bolshevism. The deception performed by the BBC and the total silence of the intellectuals in the face of this deception. The BBC celebrated the 25th anniversary of the Red Army without mentioning Trotsky. This was about as accurate as commemorating the Battle of Trafalgar without mentioning Nelson, but it evoked no protest from the English intelligentista. Oh, sorry, that word was wrong, it was intelligentsia. But I digress. Whatever ideology is promoted by the oligarchy is repeated by the cowardly Stroke number 5, the intellectuals, which I clearly am not. These intellectuals know that their career will only progress if they toe the party line. But if they step out of line, then they will be victimized by the oligarchy and their peers. Witness Johann... Stroke number 6. Christ, that's 2 strokes in about 10 seconds. Witness Johann Hari, Enoch Powell, Elizabeth Sabadich Wolf, Pim Fortune, Rabbi Kane. Please, no more strokes. Over the past 30 years or so, we can see that this uncritical admiration is being applied to Islam, where publishers refuse to print even-handed critical books by long-established and previously published authors. In the 1920s, the intellectuals admired Bolshevism, Mussolini, and fascism. After World War II, they still admired Bolshevism. You might think this is far-fetched, but Orwell went on to say that this kind of groupthink among British intellectuals towards the Soviet Union was not something new. The civility with which the greater part of the English intelligentsia have swallowed and repeated Russian propaganda from 1941 onwards would be quite astounding if it were not for the fact that they have behaved similarly on several earlier occasions. So what Orwell was seeing in the 1940s and what we are experiencing in recent decades with Islam is part of a much wider social and political phenomenon. Little wonder that in 1984, Orwell went on to emphasise the points he was making less overtly in Animal Farm. It wasn't just political critiques of the Bolshevik Soviet Union that were censored. Orwell points out that the events considered globally newsworthy in relation to one country would be suppressed when it came to the political group favoured by the oligarchy. Events in Russia and events elsewhere were to be judged by different standards. The endless executions and the purges of 1936 to 1938 were applauded by lifelong opponents of capital punishment, and it was considered equally proper to publish famines when they happened in India and to conceal them when they happened in Ukraine. These double standards didn't just apply to silence by the intellectuals during World War II, but are dated by Orwell as far back as 1931. As Orwell points out, uncritical loyalty to the USSR happens to be the current orthodoxy, and where the supposed interests of the USSR are involved, they are willing to tolerate not only censorship, but with the deliberate falsification of history. In our time, one of the issues where the liberal intellectuals are demanding the censorship and falsification is with Islam. Muhammad's Quran is the only Quran which highlights the violence and hatred which are the foundation of Islam's success, and it is the only Quran which denounces this hatred and violence. The liberal intellectuals pretend to abhor hatred and violence, when in truth they want to shield Islam from having the hatred and violence it inspires from being exposed. The oligarchy pretends it opposes hate speech, but if funds... I think I said it right first time, it's just not how it's written in the book. But it funds, protects, and disseminates, rather than if, the hate speech that is the Quran. And if bans the books which demonstrate the truth about Islam. In case you think Orwell wasn't being censored, that he was just an unknown writer who couldn't get published between 1933 and 1939, he had 7 books published. Yet what turned out to be one of the most highly rated books in history, a politically tracked, skillfully disguised as a children's fairy story, was turned down by 4 major publishing companies, at a time where there was a considerable demand for new literature. Is it any wonder that most of the intellectuals in the West were silent about Islam and the oligarchy when they faced being assassinated by the former and at least having their career destroyed by the latter? In the original unpublished preface to Animal Farm, Orwell explains the fascistic censorship found among British intellectuals. A cowardly desire to keep in with the bulk of the intelligentsia. I know by heart the arguments by which they justify themselves, but at least let us have no more nonsense about defending liberty against fascism. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. That last sentence is one of the most famous observations made by Orwell and is widely quoted. Which, just to disclaim, if liberty it means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. But you will never see those quoting it explain the context in which Orwell wrote it as condemnation of the complicity of the virtuous British intellectuals with a totalitarian regime of genocide and censorship. As we see with the 21st century, intellectuals in the West, they hypocritically praise diversity while ensuring that any diversity in thinking is crushed. Anything that isn't politically correct is to be punished as hate speech. And they gaslight the public that Islam's long history of warfare, robbery, genocide, and slavery was instead a fantasy era of peace and love. Between the censorship by the government and its Ministry of Truth, the state-controlled media institutions, example the BBC, Ofcom, the government agency that controls communications, etc., etc., there are pressure groups. This is a phrase that we hear rarely now. It's as if the politicians and media wish to pretend these groups doesn't exist, or do not exist. But Orwell mentions them specifically, singling out the Catholic Church. In Britain, the Muslim Council of Britain itself claims to represent over 500 Islamic groups. We can only begin to imagine the power that such groups have when it comes down to cowardly intellectuals and their complicity in pushing and protecting Islam. In this previously unpublished preface, Orwell points out that the enemy is the gramophone mind, that is, a mentality where everyone is encouraged to simply repeat uncritical phrases the way the politicians and media do after every Islamic terrorist attack, lying to the public that Islam is a religion of peace. The failed experimental genetics engineering of mRNA is safe and effective, etc., etc. The oligarchy know exactly what they're doing. They want the public to repeatedly reach for this mantra whenever the problem of Islam arises, a version of 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, bleated by the sheep in Animal Farm. The oligarchy want the public not to remember the thousands of Islamic terrorist attacks across the world in the past 25 years alone. They want the public not to believe the evidence of their own senses, or stroke number 7, of their own senses or their own memory. We should be resisting censorship, celebrating dissent. The only diversity the oligarchy doesn't like is diversity in the ways of seeing the world. The person being silenced might actually be onto an important truth that the rest of us are missing. But the fascism of the oligarchy is incompatible with there being a variety of opinions. The fascist state decides what is true. Remember Mosley's phrase, there is nothing outside the state. Orwell concludes his preface to Animal Farm with one of the most famous principles from all of his writings. And I quote, "If freedom means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." End quote. Ironically, the statement of this famous principle occurs in a preface that wasn't heard for another 40 years. It's rare these days to even find a copy of Animal Farm that contains this famous principle. Most people reading Animal Farm have no idea it was suppressed for several years because our liberal democracy was allied to the genocidal communism criticized in this book, or in the book rather. Things are worse now than when Orwell was being censored. We paid ourselves to publish Muhammad's Quran because no publisher had the integrity or courage to print the truth. Even publishers who pride themselves on printing controversial books refused it. Yet, even having done that, what Orwell didn't need to do, Muhammad's Quran was censored in a way that which Animal Farm was not. Shops would not order it for customers. Amazon banned Muhammad's Quran, whilst to this day, Amazon are selling leftist books on how to make bombs. It is clear that the problem of fascistic censorship in our society is now worse than ever. And that is going to be where we call it. So, some interesting things to take away from that shit. It was kind of interesting how, before I saw that little bit with Donald Trump at the bottom of one of the pages, how he was, had the attempted assassination, how were other people killed off, and then I made the prediction about Donald Trump, and then, wouldn't you know it, seconds later, there it is. So it seems to me like there are things in that book that I already know. It's just I didn't realise that until obviously I came up to that point. But isn't it interesting how we can have all these lefty people trying to suppress the truth? They can't suppress the truth forever. They could try, but they won't succeed, because the bottom line is there are going to be more quizzing minds, I should say, not quisling, who will basically do everything they can to find out the truth, no matter what it takes. That was a good scratch. Anyway, they will find out the truth sooner or later. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And I'm going to do everything I can to keep pointing out what's in that book. Because at the end of the day, no matter how many strokes I'm having, in this case 7, I will put out there what needs to be said. I will put out there what the mainstream media or the government or the oligarchy do not want to be put out. Because the bottom line is, we should have a true democracy where what we're wanting, what we desire, is actually enforced, rather than a uni-party, if you will, which are two cheeks of the same arse, quite frankly. It is a shame that we have the likes of Keir the Traitor Starmer in power, who are about as interested in balanced democracy as I am in eating healthy. It's a shame that we have to put up with the constant shilling from mainstream media who keep on bleating on about, oh, Islam is a religion of peace. Well, if that's the case, what about the thousands of years of war they've caused? What about the thousands of terror attacks that they've done? I believe back on my old channel, there was even a time where I actually put up a video where I actually went through a whole bunch of terrorist attacks, and I think I even described how many casualties they were in that. Maybe I need to do that shit again and actually put into perspective just how violent this so-called religion of peace truly is. But then I suspect maybe they'll send the boys round to break my fucking legs. But the bottom line is, we need to expose this shit. Because how are you going to dismantle the oligarchy? You cast it into the light. You expose it. You call it out. You speak the truth. You challenge their views. Because at the end of the day, if the views get out there that these guys are not on our side, their credibility goes. Just like that. So that is why I will continue reading this book, and I will continue to try and put out the facts out there. And I will do it even if it causes me to have more strokes than the Oxford rowing team, quite frankly. We must do all we can to fight the oligarchy. And as the book says, we must celebrate dissent, because we must not comply with whatever the oligarchy wants, because we're only giving them what they want otherwise. We must swat this fly out of the sky and teach the oligarchy a lesson that we, the people, have the power to change everything. And if they don't want to listen, then we will take matters into our own hands.